The National Broadcasting Company presents a special bulletin from the Press Radio Bureau. Washington. President Roosevelt appealed to the people of America tonight to support their community chests and other local charities. He pointed out that government assistance to the needy has not removed or even diminished the need for private charity. The address opens the 1938 mobilization for human needs. Mr. Roosevelt told the American people that they have always been generous. That generosity has never failed, he said, and please God, it never will. He declared that private generosity is not contradictory in principle to government efforts toward relief. This bulletin is from the Press Radio Bureau. Further details will be found in your newspaper. The story behind the headlines, presented by the American Historical Association in cooperation with the National Broadcasting Company with Caesar Sechinger. Each week, Mr. Sechinger, noted foreign correspondent, radio commentator, and author, discusses dominant news events either in our own country or abroad and sketches the historical background leading up to it. This evening, Mr. Sechinger's subject is Minorities and the Threat to World Peace. Ladies and gentlemen, Caesar Sechinger brings you the story behind the headlines.
Good evening, everybody. Germans occupy 5th Sudeten Zone. Poles rush troops to Czech City. Hungarians mobilize against Czechs. To read the headlines of the past week that have to do with the aftermath of the world crisis, you would think that the so-called Peace of Munich had become a Central European free-for-all, with troops rushing in on Czechoslovakia from all sides, tearing the body of the last mid-European republic limb from limb. Well, it isn't quite as bad as that, for the Rump Republic is going to be allowed to live. But what is happening to Czechoslovakia has shocked our consciences as no other event in living memory. Considering that, after all, almost no blood has been shed, while sanguinary struggles are going on in other parts of the world, we may well stop to ask what it is that puts the crisis of Czechoslovakia above all the other current crises in our minds. The difference is that these other human tragedies are due to mass violence, to the lawlessness and mechanized barbarism that we have come to accept as the inevitable consequence of war. This European tragedy is due to acts committed in the name of justice, legalized and sanctioned by the great powers, accepted by the world as the only alternative to a Holocaust such as civilized mankind might not survive. At the same time, we must not forget that there was a basis of justice in the complaints of the Sudeten Germans. But the realization that the Sudetens are, or were, only one of a number of so-called national minorities in Europe may well make us shudder at the prospect of further readjustments under the slogan of national or racial self-determination. Most of us, I am sure, had not even heard of the Sudeten Germans until last spring, although they and their ancestors have been settled in their valleys for 400 or 500 years. And most of us still don't know about the Germans in Hungary, the Transylvanian Germans in Romania, the Silesian Germans in Poland, the Baltic Germans in Lithuania, the Tyrolean Germans in Italy, and the odd patches of Germans in Yugoslavia and even Soviet Russia, where over 500,000 of them constitute the German Volga Republic. Nor did many of us know about the 4 million Ruthenians in Poland, the 1.5 million Hungarians in Romania, the 500,000 Yugoslavians in Italy, and the Macedonians in Bulgaria, all good sizable minorities. And those of us who did know about them were only too willing to let sleeping dogs lie, until this Czech crisis pulled us all up sharp. The plain fact is that while there were some 60 million people in the various minority groups of pre-war Europe, the peace settlement took care of only about half of them, so that after 1919 there were 30 million left. This isn't strictly accurate, of course, for some of the post-war minorities were created by the Peace of Paris, having been detached from their own countries in the process of eliminating other minorities. For instance, take the Sudeten Germans. They were just German Bohemians in the old Austrian Empire and part of the ruling German group. The Czechs and Slovaks, on the other hand, were minorities and were treated as such. So after being bottom dog for centuries, they became top dog after the war, and the Germans living inside the historic frontiers of Bohemia became the bottom dog. So you see, these attempts at adjustment are apt to reverse the problem instead of solving it. In one way or another, then, we had roughly 30 million minority population in Europe at the end of the war. The carving up of Czechoslovakia will dispose of, let's say, 4.25 million. But from that you must deduct the 3/4 million or so Czechs and Slovaks living in the ceded districts. So the total minorities population in Europe is reduced by 3.5 million net, leaving some 26.5 million still living under what they consider foreign domination. Now, it is true that most of these minorities have not been shouting for help, at least not very loudly. But you see how once somebody begins to shout, the desire becomes contagious. The real reason why we haven't heard any but the Sudetans lately is that they aren't all so lucky as to have a big brother nearby. Or if they have, the big brother isn't usually as big and powerful as the bad uncle under whose roof they live. For instance, there are nearly 1 million Poles left in post-war Germany. But however badly they might be treated, we are not likely to hear Marshal Snigely Ridge of Poland clamoring for their release. On the other hand, Poland itself harbors the largest single minority in Europe, namely the Ruthenians. Most of these live in the Ukraine, a country formerly belonging to Russia, and now divided between Soviet Russia and Poland. What is to stop Mr. Stalin from one day espousing the cause of these little Russians and of the 1.5 million white Russians in Poland, if and when he feels himself strong enough to do so? Here, then, is a potential threat to the European peace, all the more so since Mr. Hitler has been credited with having an eye on the Russian part of the Ukraine further south. But more recently, Mr. Hitler has assured Mr. Chamberlain that the Sudeten conquest satisfies all his territorial ambitions in Europe. That would mean that the 500,000 Germans in Hungary, the 750,000 Germans in Romania, the 500,000 Germans in Yugoslavia, the 250,000 Tyroleans in Italy, not to mention the 1 million Germans in Poland, have just got to accept their fate. 3 million Germans resigned to being ruled by Slavs, Magyars, Italians, and Romanians? Well, maybe. But is it likely that the 1.5 million Hungarians in Romania, most of them living in a fairly solid block adjacent to a fairly solid block of Germans, will be satisfied to stay outside Hungary now that most of their compatriots in Czechoslovakia are to be reunited with the motherland? And is it entirely out of the range of possibilities that in a future drive for frontier revision, Hungary will be supported by Germany? Now, whatever the economic plans that go with the recapture of national minorities, and however insincere some governments may be in exploiting the woes of minorities in weaker neighboring states, we have to admit that the existence of these minorities is the immediate cause of the conflict. It is well, therefore, for us to be familiar with the whys and wherefores of these minorities in order that we may know how to judge the merits of the case before the crisis is upon us. 1,500 years ago, Europe was inhabited by semi-barbaric tribes looking for habitable, fertile lands. The great movement was from east to west, and each tribe or racial group, as it settled in Europe, felt the pressure of new hordes coming out of Asia in its rear. Celts, Teutons, Slavs moved across the continent in great waves, pressing upon each other and upon the vestiges of Roman civilization in the west and south. Out of the impact of these forces came the continuous struggles between nations, struggles about land, minerals, necessities of life, struggles about differences of religion, struggles about channels of trade, and about the dynastic ambitions of princes. In the west of Europe, it happened that power soon became centralized, resulting in fairly large national units like France and Spain. But Central Europe was divided into many smaller units, constantly changing their allegiance and constantly engaged in warfare. The so-called Holy Roman Empire of the German nation was for centuries only a loose federation with divided loyalties between the church and the temporal princes. Yet it was successful in pushing back the Slavic, Magyar, and Muslim tides from the east. It not only warded off attacks, but absorbed some of the foreign elements, and so the Slavic kingdom of Bohemia and the Magyar kingdom of Hungary, for instance, finally became dynastic possessions of the Habsburg. In this constant struggle, races overlapped, frontiers took little account of race or speech. The concept of nationality was less important in a feudal Europe than the claims of kings and dukes and lesser warlords. Not till the close of the 18th century, or near the close of the 18th century, did the fortunes of peoples as such play any role. Map-making was merely the expression of dynastic interests. But the French Revolution brought the rights of nations to the fore. The idea that populations and peoples could be bartered back and forth by rulers went out of fashion. Even Napoleon claimed to make his conquests as a liberator. So in the 19th century, there was a transition from dynastic to nationalistic conflict. Nationalism, fostered by general education and the spread of democracy, grew in intensity and reached its climax before the outbreak of the World War. It was then that the word minorities became an important political term. Austro-Hungary was the classic minority state, a mosaic of nationalities. The immediate cause of the World War was nationalistic agitation, culminating, as you remember, in the murder of the Austrian Crown Prince. The World War, ostensibly at any rate, was fought on the issue of national liberty, and in the Peace of Paris, the statesmen did undertake to remedy the minority situation. But it was obvious that absolute self-determination would result in confusion. No territorial adjustment could untangle the intricate skein created by centuries of racial drifts. So while some injustices were eliminated, new ones were inevitably created. And the racial map of Central Europe is still pockmarked with hundreds of multicolored spots. Nothing is more likely, said Woodrow Wilson at the Peace Conference, to disturb the peace of the world than the treatment which might in certain circumstances be meted out to minorities. To forestall such treatment, the Allies and the League came to special minorities treaties or agreements with all the newly created or aggrandized countries, and charged the League of Nations with the job of seeing that the provisions were carried out. They comprise equality before the law, of civil and political rights, in business and education, and freedom of worship. There have been frequent complaints of the violations of these guarantees, but the League has generally only sought to point the way to conciliation. There is reason to believe that this procedure would have worked in the case of Czechoslovakia had Germany been a member of the League and concerned only about the Sudeten Germans and not the territory they occupy. As for the small and scattered minorities, excepting the Jews, of course, whose problem is the most tragically difficult of all, most of them are probably quite happy where they are. The example of Switzerland, with 3 distinct racial and linguistic groups, proves that with equal rights, contrasting races can live together in harmony. The enforcement of equal rights everywhere would therefore seem to be a major task of European statesmanship. Trouble over a single 3 million minority brought Europe to the brink of war. Wherever there are grievances, real or fancied, they had better be dealt with before it is too late. Good night.
Copies of these talks, The Story Behind the Headlines by Caesar Searchinger, are available in printed form. They are issued by the Columbia University Press in the form of a bulletin which includes additional material and bibliography. They may be had for 10 cents apiece or $1 for the first 13 issues by addressing The Story Behind the Headlines, NBC, Radio City. This program, presented by the American Historical Association, is an NBC educational feature. Next.